Get out your Epi Dictionary. Listening to the news about COVID-19 or any other emerging disease, you might start to wonder if epidemiologists have their own language. For instance, what's the difference between an endemic disease and an epidemic? What's worse, an outbreak or an epidemic? When does an epidemic become a pandemic? Endemic disease. These are the diseases that are always around, the ones doctors expect to see year after year in particular areas of the world. Malaria is rarely seen in North America, but it is endemic to certain parts of Africa, where it occurs regularly. Outbreak. When a relatively small number of people get sick with the same disease at around the same time, it's called an outbreak. An outbreak of disease could be triggered by a single event, like some undercooked hamburgers that send everyone at a family reunion to the hospital. Or an outbreak can happen when an endemic disease from one place turns up unexpectedly somewhere else. For instance, in 2019, someone with dengue fever visited Hawaii and was bitten by mosquitoes. Those mosquitoes transmitted the disease to other people in Hawaii, causing an outbreak. Epidemic. An epidemic is an outbreak multiplied. New cases are actively spreading, and the numbers of cases are higher than what is normally expected. When doctors start reporting an unusual number of patients with the same symptoms, public health authorities may declare that there is an epidemic underway. They'll alert the media so that people can take precautions against the disease. Pandemic. If the epidemic can't be contained, it may become a pandemic, a global epidemic that infects a large number of people over a very wide area in different countries and regions of the globe. The World Health Organization considers that when an epidemic is reported in 3 or more countries, it's officially a pandemic. One way to remember the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic is the P. A pandemic is an epidemic with a passport. Chapter 1. A Deadly Year. The Great Plague of London, 1665. The rat looked dead. Good woman Phillips nudged it with her toe to be sure. It didn't move. She bent down, pinched its tail between her thumb and forefinger, and lifted the rat up so it dangled limply before her face. "Come into my kitchen and die on my clean floor, will you?" she said menacingly to the little corpse. "We'll see about that, you dirty beast." Good woman noticed with disgust that fleas were still jumping in the rat's coarse black fur. It hadn't been dead for long, probably frozen to death. The winter of 1665 was the coldest she could remember. She opened the door and swung the rat by its tail, flinging it as far from the house as she could. It landed with a thud in the gutter. Good riddance, thought Good woman Phillips. She wiped her hands on her skirt before heading inside to make breakfast. She thought no more about the rat that day. She was a busy woman, with a husband and sons to feed. For a poor family like hers, living outside the walls of London in the rough and tumble parish of St. Giles in the Fields, food was often hard to come by. Worse, with this winter's dreadful cold, they needed more fuel than usual for the fire. Good woman feared that the extra expense would mean Christmas, not even a week away, would be a lean and dismal holiday this year. Good woman Phillips was right to worry about Christmas. There would be no celebrating in her home. As that dark December day wore on, her head began aching, and pain grew in her back, arms, and legs until she could hardly stand. Then fever and chills set in. By evening, she was forced to take to her bed. She lay in a daze, trying not to moan. Signs in the sky. Day by day, Good woman Phillips got sicker. Her sons sat by her bedside in the evening, trying to distract her with the latest news from London. The whole city was buzzing with rumors about the comet that had been seen flaring across the heavens every clear night since November. Many believed that the comet was a sign from God to England's king, Charles II, who had been on the throne for just 4 years. People remembered an old superstition that the crowning of a new king would be followed by plague. These blazing stars threatened the world with famine, plague, and wars. To princes, death; to kingdoms, many crises; to all estates, inevitable losses. was the dismal forecast of one popular astrologer. As a fresh wave of fever shook Goodwoman Phillips, her sons crept away, leaving her to rest. Soon, she was tossing in a restless, feverish sleep. House call. When Goodwoman Phillips opened her eyes next, it was light in the room. A tall man in a long coat was unpacking a leather satchel and laying out items along the wooden bench under the window. A cup, a cloth, a knife. Goodwoman realized at once who this man was and why he was there. A doctor. "I'll not be bled." She tried for a firm, clear tone, but even to her own ears her voice was low and faltering. The doctor turned and looked at her calmly. "Goody Phillips, your husband and sons have consulted me about your case. Bleeding will balance the humors within your body. It is for the best." The doctor came closer. She could see the knife glinting in his hand. Then it was done. A smooth, quick cut on her arm. Blood dripped into the cup he held up. Her head thudded and the room seemed to lift and tilt, then spin. "Fainted," said the doctor. "Not uncommon for one so far gone with fever. Let's hope this bloodletting was done in time." Goodwoman Phillips didn't wake again. On Christmas Eve of 1664, she died, the first victim in an epidemic of plague that was to kill nearly 1 in 5 Londoners over the coming year. It's not funny, it's humoral. From ancient times until the 19th century, when a doctor told you your humors were out of balance, he didn't mean that there was something wrong with your funny bone. Humoral theory was one of the key principles in Western medicine. According to this theory, first proposed by the doctors of ancient Greece, the human body contained 4 humors, or fluids: black bile, also known as melancholy, yellow or red bile, blood, and phlegm. Your health depended on maintaining the right humoral balance, or mix of fluids, inside your body. Curing disease was a matter of putting the humors back in balance. This is where the idea of bleeding patients came from. God have mercy upon us. A neighbor woman came that afternoon to wash the body and prepare it for burial. When the neighbor removed Goodwoman Phillips' nightdress, she gasped. Large red rings had appeared on the dead woman's chest and back. Under her right arm was an ominous purple swelling. "A bubo! Plague tokens!" whimpered the shaken woman. "Plain as my hand. These are the signs. This is a plague house. Oh, God have mercy on us." She turned and fled down the stairs and out of the house. Before long, there was a knocking at the door of the Phillipses' tiny house. The searcher had arrived. It was the searcher's duty to visit every house where a death occurred in St. Giles in the Fields, to examine the deceased and to report back to the parish clerk, who recorded the cause of death in the parish register. All 119 London parishes kept registers of births and deaths, bulky volumes filled with line after line describing deaths from old age, accidents, and illnesses of every kind. Yet of all the ways to die in 1664, none was more feared than plague, for plague could spread through a neighborhood like fire. In a matter of weeks, plague could engulf a whole city, even a whole country. The searcher for St. Giles in the Field was a shrunken, wrinkled old woman. She was desperately poor and spent every cent she had on ale at the inn. It was well known that she'd gladly take a coin or two should a family wish to have the cause of death changed in the report she delivered to the parish clerk. For a small tip, a suicide could become an accident. Even plague could be registered as a simple fever. But the Phillips family had no money to offer her. Her sons had spent everything they had to bring the doctor in to bleed their mother. The searcher peered down drunkenly at the body, then reeled away in alarm at the sight of the swollen lumps called buboes. Proof that Goodwoman Phillips had died of the disease we now know as bubonic plague. She staggered off, returning later with men from the parish office, who began boarding up the doors and windows. The dead woman's family would not be allowed to leave their house for weeks in case they spread plague to others. Inside the darkened house, Goodman Phillips and his sons listened as nail after nail was pounded into the boards blocking their windows. Finally, the pounding was replaced by the softer sound of brushes. A huge red cross was painted on their door, and the words, "God have mercy upon us." Those signs let everyone in the neighborhood know that this house was cursed with the plague. That Christmas Eve, all was silent in the Phillips house. Good Woman's husband and sons could only wait and wonder which of them would be next. Outside, their neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past the boarded-up house, fearing that if they came too close, they would be contaminated with plague seeds. The fear builds. A little more than a week after the death of Good Woman Phillips, soon after New Year's, John Grant stepped to the door of his London shop and tossed a coin to one of the ragged boys shivering in the frosty January air outside. "Run, fetch me a copy of the Bills of Mortality. The first bill of the year was printed this morning, and I'm anxious to see it. You may find me in a generous mood to repay you for your speed." As he watched the boy disappear up the cobbled road, John considered how surprising it was that the Bills of Mortality, a page of statistics listing the week's births and deaths in each London parish, should have become so popular with readers. Each week in the coffee houses and the taverns, conversation was sure to turn to the latest news in the bills, especially if there were any unusual deaths. John Grant always found the Bills of Mortality fascinating, but he'd heard that there was something he would find particularly interesting in this week's edition. And when the errand boy ran back with the page fluttering in his hands, it didn't take long for John to spot it. Death by Plague 1. London hadn't had an epidemic of plague for nearly 20 years, and plague usually struck in the hot months of summer, not in the midst of the coldest winter that anyone could remember. But all the same, John decided to keep a close eye on the bills over the next few months. For the rest of that cold, dark winter, while all of London was watching the sky, John was scanning the lists of deaths, reading the signs there that told him an epidemic of plague was coming again. Looking for answers. As the owner of a popular haberdashery, a store selling cloth, John Grant was an expert on everything from the coarsest cottons to the finest silks and velvets, along with buttons, thread, and ribbons in every color of the rainbow. But running a successful business wasn't enough to keep John's active mind occupied. He really wanted to make a name for himself as a scientist or a scholar. He'd always been fascinated with the weekly Bills of Mortality, and by the late 1650s, he had saved several years' worth of the weekly statistics. John realized that those dusty stacks held a treasure trove of information. As a businessman, he knew the value of having information about his customers. He needed to know approximately how many births to expect each year so that he could stock the right amount of delicate linen for christening robes. And by knowing how many deaths there might be in a year, he could have enough cloth for mourning clothes on hand. At the time, there was no source for this kind of data. John, like other shopkeepers, was forced to depend on his intuition and experience when ordering his stock. Yet since 1592, the weekly Bills of Mortality had been tracking these numbers and more. By reading through all the bills and adding up the deaths and the births, John realized he would be able to work out annual averages and perhaps find useful patterns. He began to wonder what other uses there might be for information about birth and death rates in his city. Comparing the numbers of deaths and their causes from one year to another might reveal patterns not only in how many people were dying, but also why. John Grant decided that he had found the perfect subject for a scientific study. What about dying of curiosity? Plague wasn't the only thing killing Londoners during the 17th century. The Bills of Mortality were full of unusual ways to die. Some that you are not likely to see in an obituary today include stoppage in the stomach, twisting of the guts, eaten by lice, and the mysterious horseshoe head